So we did some testing and smelling, and we even did a dry matter test, and our hops are ready to harvest. But how do we harvest our plants? We pick the cones, we cut the plant. Hey friends, Max Raphael here from Hops World, tip number 48. How to harvest our hops. Let's do it. Okay, friends, glad you could be with me here today to talk about how we harvest our hops. Before I go into how we actually personally do it on a smaller scale, I'll show you quickly how they harvest hops in the big farms and the big plantations around the world. First, I'm going to put up this little video from my friend Joris Camby. He's in Belgium. He's been growing hops for years, all his life. And what they do in many of the farms in Europe is they drive very quickly, rather quickly, down the hops row with a tractor and a trailer behind. And they cut the bottom of the plant, and they have an apparatus that attaches to the tractor that actually cuts the bottom of the plant and then grabs it and pulls it. And it actually breaks the twine at the top wire. And my friend Joris, he actually uses a twine that has a little metal wire at the top. Just a little part that can actually break very easily. So that's how they do it there in Europe and many of the farms. Now in the United States, there's a few ways they do it the same way, and they actually have what's called a top cutter. It's a machine that spins and cuts them top wires as opposed to just ripping them off. But the same idea. But I went out to Yakima Valley 2 years ago, and there's a few farms, especially this one here, Hopsteiner. They actually invented their own hops picking machine. And what they do is they actually drive down the rows, and 2 rows at a time enter the machine, and they actually pick all the cones and all the leaves, and a majority of the leaves and all the stems go shooting out the side of the machine, and they're left with just cones and leaves. And then they actually just take the cones and leaves back to a processing center, and they just do separation. And here's a little video here that you just saw showing that when I was there. So that's basically how they do it on a big commercial scale, 200 acres, 500 acres, even 1,000 acres, or 10 or 20 acres. But for us, I have about, right now, at least 200 plants. Sometimes I have 400. I have an experimental hop yard here. So if you don't have a big hop yard and a big tractor with a trailer or a top cutter or one of these big giant machines from Hopsteiner, I'm going to show you how we pick our hops cones here. But hey, before we go outside, I want to say a couple things real quick in the beginning of the video, because most people don't watch all the way till the end. If you didn't already see our tip number 8, are my hops cones ready to pick? Check it out. I'll put a link right up here. And you can test your hops cones by smell, by touch, actually by hearing also. And we have another tip, is how to do a dry matter test. This is the proper way to test your cones to see if they're ready to pick. If you have more than one plant or plants that are pretty big, you could do this kind of test. That's tip number 16. You could put another tip over here, okay? And now, after this tip, number 48, we're gonna post real soon here in the next few days, tip number 49 and tip number 50. How to dry my hops and post-harvest hops. How do we store them or how do we use them? It's the next 2 tips, number 49 and 50, will be coming real soon. Keep your eye out for them. And while you're at it, hit that like button, that thumbs up, and subscribe to our channel. Tell your friends if they're ready to pick their hops. You'll get all the new tips coming up. So let's do it. Out to the hop yard. Okay, so here we are out here in our experimental hop yard. 90% are varieties that we actually created from seed, all from plants we planted as late as May this year to plants from 3 years ago. But we definitely have some plants that are ready to pick. I did some tests on a couple of these, and we even did a dry matter test or two on a few of our second and third year varieties. So we're going to show you how we pick our hops plants. We'll explain quickly that we do it in 3 ways, okay, depending on how many cones and the size of the plant. And I'm going to tell you each way and the advantages of the way that we do it. So the first way that we do it is we actually pick only the cones off the plant. Now, why do we do this? This is only on plants that are new, that have very few cones. It's just easier to only pick the cones, because one of the biggest advantages, and what you really want to try to do, is only pick the cones off your plants. Why? Because what happens in the time when your plant is going to overwinter, that cold period when your plant dries out by itself, the natural carbohydrates and nutrients that are up in the top part of the plant actually translocate down into the rhizomes of the plant. And that's why hops, part of the reason why hops has rhizomes, is stores that energy in the fall and then causes regrowth in the spring. So by cutting all that growth, it really impedes all that possibility of them nutrients going down into the bottom of the plant. And historically, years ago, they only picked the cones. They used to actually use stilts sometimes to pick the cones. And actually in England, they still have dwarf hop yards that are only, I think, 9 or 10 feet tall, that they leave the plants and they have picking machines that only pick the cones off the plants, and the plants stay. So that's actually the best situation for your plant for the next spring. Now there are the advantages. It's probably less work if it only has a few cones, and it helps the plant in the spring. A big disadvantage is you're probably going to have to climb a ladder to get up to the top to pick the cones. In our case, luckily, we have a retractable trellis. So as you can see here, I've been lowering the trellis real quickly, and we bring a bucket or a container out there in the hop yard with us when only there's a handful of cones. These plants here were planted in May this year in pots. I didn't even expect them to get any cones. It was kind of a, well, they're growing, it's real late, I'm not going to throw them out. There are new crosses that have hope for a new variety. So I planted them in our low trellis. It's only 10 feet tall, and it actually has plants in pots that are going to go in the ground in the spring. But there are some cones, and just to do some sensory testing, we're going to pick them. And here's what we're doing here, as you can see in this little video. When we get done picking, we actually crank the plant back up. In your case, you probably need to use a ladder and just pick the cones off and take them in to dry. Okay, the second method that I use on plants that are typically the first year plants, and you can see in this video, this plant here is a first year plant, but it has some real nice branches coming off it and some real pretty cones. But I would rather leave the plant to gain energy for the fall, to go down into the ground and come back in the spring. So what I do is I cut pieces or cut branches. Now I've seen people do this with big giant plants too, cut them in branches out in the hops field so they can take them to where they can pick the cones off the branches. One thing I want to tell you, slight disadvantage anytime you're out here in the hops field is if it's sunny, if it's rainy, if it's hot. I'm sweating right now. So we want to really, if we can, If the plants are too big to get the branches, if we cut the branches, we want to take them into a shady area, outside or inside, and pick the cones. So in this case, as you can see, what I've been doing here on this plant is cutting all the branches, putting them in a bucket, and I'll take them indoors and actually pick the cones. That leaves the main vine, it leaves some of the leaves, some of the stem that'll really help translocate this plant. And I don't think it's necessary to actually cut the whole plant and carry it all the way inside. So that's our second way that we pick the cones. An advantage, you don't have to take the whole plant inside. It could be less work. Disadvantage, you probably have to climb on a ladder. And another advantage is the plant stays there to translocate the energy back down into the ground. So the third method I'm going to show you is cutting the whole plant. So when I say the whole plant, I don't mean the whole plant, because we want to leave as much as possible of the existing plant when we cut it. So even though it's not the whole plant, whatever's left will translocate back into the ground when the plant dries out naturally. So we cut the plant typically just below where the cones begin. Normally it's like 3 to 5 feet off the ground. Wherever the cones start, we cut just below that, and we leave the rest of that plant to dry out by itself. One thing that I do though is I put that part of the plant up on our irrigation hose or our wire that's running across, or I've seen people tie it back up. You don't really want to let that part be laying down on the ground. And you can see here where we cut the bottom of the plant right there at the level. As you can see, this plant's a monster here. This is one of our crosses we made with Chinook. This is 2 years ago. And we cut just below the cones at the bottom, let the plant hang. And you're going to either have to climb a ladder and cut the top, or in Brazil, I had a long piece of bamboo with a razor knife just taped to it, and I could hold the string tight and cut it. Here in the US, I have this little contraption. As you can see, I think it's made to cut branches up high and trees, and it cuts the top wire, and we just let the plant fall on the ground, and we take the whole plant over to our picking area. You can set up a little tent or a table somewhere in the shade, preferably outside, or if you have a big barn, a lot of people pick a barn. Be ready if you have a lot of plants to invite a lot of friends, relatives, aunts, uncles, grandmas, your kids, everyone. Maybe the dog if you could teach them. But the advantages of cutting the whole plant is you're not out there in the field picking all these plants, all these cones in the sun. It's just really not practical. Disadvantage, you're not allowing the whole plant to be there to translocate the energy back down into the rhizomes. And another big advantage is you don't have to climb a ladder. So that are the 3 ways, folks, that we here harvest our hops. So I want to mention this for those of you that are growing hops in areas possibly that aren't typical growing areas where we grow hops. Because, for example, in Brazil, we get 2 harvests per year. There's people even getting 3. And a lot of people that are near the equator down in Florida, they're getting 2 harvests per year also. And what we have found that after the first harvest, which really comes mid-season, what happens is when we cut the plants, we do not cut them just below the level of the cones, because it's still warm and it's still summertime, and the plant does not dry out naturally, and it wants to re-sprout. So you really want new sprouts from the crown of the plant, from underground, to come up. So that first harvest, we cut the plants right at ground level, and then they sprout stronger from the ground. And then the second harvest, which would be really in the fall and before it gets cold, because it does get cold enough for the plants to dry out, believe it or not, down there in Brazil, and stay dry for 2 or 3 months. Then we cut the plants just below the cones. So we leave them dry out by themselves, okay? But that's how we harvest our hops. Okay, here we are back in Hops World, and we have our freshly picked branches that we cut. And basically what we do now, we could use the scissors if we like, but for me it's way quicker just taking my hands and picking the cones. Now, whether it's just these branches or a big giant plant, you got to make sure you bring the plants somewhere in the shade, whether it's outside, even put up a tarp or a tent, or inside, get some fans going, somewhere cool, okay, to pick your hops. So we clear all the branches of all the cones, get rid of all the leaves to where we just have cones, and then we either get ready to use them or dry them. Now, a really important tip. If it's your first time, or if you're allergic, or you're not used to hops, these little branches have little hairs that are actually little spines. They can actually give you little slice marks or scratches all over your arms. So it's not a bad idea to wear long sleeves and maybe even some rubber gloves. Okay, I'm really used to it, so it's no big deal. So I'm gonna finish picking here and get to drying. Well, friends, I'm really glad you could be with me. This is my favorite time of year, all year waiting for the day we can actually harvest our hops. And stay tuned for tip number 49, how to dry our hops, and tip number 50, post-harvest hop storage. Or do we use them right now to make beer? Thanks for being with me, folks. I can't wait till next time. Cheers to life.